When 29-year-old architect Sarah Brennan signed the purchase agreement for the abandoned Whitmore Estate at a county tax auction, she thought she was simply securing her dream renovation project and a chance to escape her failed marriage. But hidden beneath the estate's crumbling ballroom floor lay a sealed chamber that local families had spent a century ensuring stayed buried. A chamber containing evidence of a tragedy, so carefully concealed that revealing it would unravel the carefully constructed reputations of Millbrook's founding families and force a reckoning with sins passed down through 4 generations. Before we jump into this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something even more extraordinary to share. The autumn rain fell steadily as Sarah Brennan stood before the wrought-iron gates of Whitmore Estate, keys clutched in her trembling hand. Behind her, the moving truck idled on the narrow country road, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically through the mist. The driver, a burly man named Tom, who'd made the trip from Boston, peered through his rain-streaked windshield at the overgrown driveway ahead. "You sure this is the right place, lady?" he called out his window, doubt heavy in his voice. "Doesn't look like anybody's lived here in forever." "That's exactly right," Sarah replied, pushing wet hair from her face. "Nobody's lived here since 1924. Tom's expression shifted from doubt to something closer to alarm. "And you're planning to stay here, alone?" Sarah turned back to face the estate, her architect's eye already cataloguing the work ahead, despite her exhaustion. Behind her stretched everything she owned after the divorce, furniture from the apartment she could no longer afford, boxes of books and drafting supplies, the expensive espresso machine that had been a wedding gift from her ex-husband's parents. 3 years of marriage reduced to the contents of a 16-foot truck. "I'll be fine," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "This is my fresh start." The gates protested with a metallic shriek as Sarah pushed them open, the sound echoing across the empty landscape like a warning. Beyond stretched a tree-lined driveway, once grand, but now barely visible beneath years of accumulated leaves and encroaching vegetation. The oaks on either side had grown wild, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow the fading afternoon light. Whitmore Estate itself materialized through the mist, like something from a Gothic novel, a Victorian mansion that had once been the crown jewel of Millbrook, Connecticut. 3 stories of deteriorating grandeur, its once pristine white paint now gray and peeling in long strips that hung like torn wallpaper. Windows stared out like hollow eyes, some broken, others boarded up with weathered plywood. Ivy had claimed the entire east wing, its tendrils creeping across stone and wood with the patience of decades. The property encompassed 12 acres according to the deed, including what Sarah could make out through the rain. An old carriage house listing dangerously to one side, a greenhouse with most of its glass panes shattered or missing, and what must have once been formal gardens, but now resembled a small wilderness of overgrown hedges and wild roses. It had cost her $175,000 at the county tax auction 3 weeks ago, suspiciously less than she'd budgeted, inexplicably less than its assessed value. The kind of price that should have triggered alarm bells, and perhaps would have, if Sarah hadn't been so desperate for an escape route from her unraveling life. The auction had been strange from the start. She'd arrived at the courthouse, expecting competition. The property listing had mentioned 12 acres and a historic mansion, terms that usually drew developers and flippers like sharks to blood. Instead, she'd found a nearly empty room, just 5 other bidders, all locals based on their conversations, and the county clerk, a thin woman in her 60s, who'd seemed almost nervous as she prepared to start the proceedings. When Whitmore Estate came up for auction, something odd had happened. The other bidders had exchanged glances, not the competitive assessment of rivals, but something else: recognition, understanding. One by one, they'd simply walked away. No bids, no competition. Just Sarah, confused but relieved, offering the opening bid of $150,000. The clerk had paused, her hand hovering over the gavel. "Are you certain, Miss Brennan, this property has particular challenges?" "I've reviewed the inspection reports," Sarah had replied. "I'm aware of the structural issues." "That's not quite what I meant." The clerk's eyes had held something Sarah couldn't decipher at the time. A warning, perhaps, or pity. But she'd brought the gavel down anyway. "Sold to Miss Sarah Brennan for $175,000. The other attendees had filed out quickly, not meeting Sarah's eyes. Only one, an elderly man with a weathered face, had stopped at the door. "You're making a mistake," he'd said simply. "Some places are abandoned for good reason." Sarah had dismissed it as small-town superstition. Now, standing before the looming mansion, as rain drummed against the truck behind her, she felt the first whisper of doubt. "You want me to wait?" Tom called from the truck. "Make sure you can get inside before I leave." Sarah considered it. The sensible answer was yes. But Tom charged by the hour, and she'd already spent too much of her dwindling savings on the move from Boston. Besides, she had the keys. She was a licensed architect with a decade of experience in historic preservation. This was exactly the kind of project she'd trained for, the kind of challenge that would prove she didn't need her ex-husband's construction company, or his family's money, or any of the life they'd built together. "I'm good," she told him. "Just help me unload the essentials, and you can head back." They worked quickly in the rain, carrying boxes and furniture onto the covered porch. The front door stood before them, an impressive piece of carved oak with an art glass window depicting a peacock. Sarah fitted the largest key into the lock, half expecting it to snap. Instead, it turned smoothly, as if the mechanism had been maintained, despite the building's century of abandonment. The door required significant force to open, its hinges screaming in protest. The sound seemed to echo through the empty house and across the grounds, and Sarah could have sworn she saw curtains twitch in the windows of neighboring properties, visible through the trees, despite the rain and distance. "Jesus," Tom muttered, peering into the shadowy interior. "You sure about this?" The entrance hall stretched before them, vast and dark. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see it was remarkable. A grand staircase swept upward, its hand-carved banister still intact, though several steps had clearly rotted through. An enormous chandelier hung from the two-story ceiling, its crystals clouded with grime but miraculously unbroken. The floor was intricate parquet, water-damaged in places, but showing glimpses of its original beauty. But it was the furniture that made them both pause. The house wasn't just abandoned, it was frozen in time. A hall tree by the door still held several coats, their fabric rotted to fragments. An umbrella stand contained the rusted remains of parasols. The side table held a silver tray, now black with tarnish, where visitors would have once left calling cards. It looked as if the occupants had simply stepped out for an afternoon walk and never returned. "This is creepy as hell," Tom said flatly. "I've done a lot of moves, and this is officially the creepiest place I've ever been." Sarah couldn't argue, but she also couldn't afford to turn back now. She'd sold everything to buy this place, burned her bridges in Boston, told everyone who doubted her that she was going to transform this estate into something magnificent. A boutique inn, perhaps, or an event venue. Something that would prove she didn't need her ex-husband's success to define her own. They finished unloading in silence, piling boxes and furniture in the entrance hall. Tom accepted his payment, wished her luck with the kind of emphasis that suggested she'd need it, and left quickly, his truck's taillights disappearing down the driveway with what seemed like undue haste. And then Sarah was alone. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of settling timbers. Sarah stood in the entrance hall, surrounded by her belongings, and allowed herself one moment of pure terror at what she'd done. Then she pushed it aside, pulled out her tablet and flashlight, and began to work. The first floor revealed itself room by room, each space a capsule of forgotten luxury. To the left of the entrance, pocket doors opened into a formal parlor. The furniture remained in place, a velvet settee now gray with dust and mold, wing-back chairs positioned before a massive fireplace, side tables still bearing ornaments and books. The wallpaper, once presumably vibrant, had faded to sepia tones, peeling away in long strips that revealed older layers beneath. Sarah took photographs and notes, her professional training overriding her unease. Water damage in the northeast corner, suggesting roof problems. Original plaster medallion on the ceiling, intact. Hardwood floors in good condition beneath the grime. This room could be restored. It would be expensive, certainly, but possible. The dining room was even more remarkable, and more disturbing. A table stood in the center, still set for 12 people. China plates sat at each place setting, covered in a century of dust. Crystal glasses stood like sentinels. In the center, what must have once been a floral arrangement had desiccated to a pile of stems and dust. It looked like a meal had been planned, prepared for, and then simply abandoned. Sarah photographed everything, trying to document rather than imagine the story behind this frozen moment. Had there been a dinner party planned for that night in October 1924? Had the table been set in anticipation of guests who never arrived? She moved through the butler's pantry into the kitchen, a vast space with an ancient coal stove and a preparation table that must have been 8 feet long. Copper pots still hung from ceiling hooks, now green with verdigris. The sink was a massive porcelain basin, stained with rust and mineral deposits. Here, too, things had been left mid-task, knives on the cutting board, a rolling pin on the floured table, its wood warped and cracked, but still recognizable. The back of the house revealed a mudroom, servants' quarters, and a door to the cellar. Sarah tried that last door but found it swollen shut, and decided that particular exploration could wait for daylight and better tools. She climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step before trusting it with her full weight. The second floor held bedrooms, 6 of them, each furnished and abandoned like the rooms below. The master suite faced east, with a 4-poster bed, still made with linens now rotted to lace. A woman's dressing table held bottles of perfume, their contents long evaporated, and a silver-backed brush and mirror set, tarnished black. One bedroom appeared to have belonged to a child. A small bed with a decorative headboard, toys arranged on shelves, a rocking horse facing the window. Sarah's flashlight beam caught something on the bedside table, a book still open, as if someone had been reading and simply set it down, intending to return. The third floor was partially collapsed, the roof damage evident in the gaping holes that let in rain, and the skeletal remains of furniture too far gone to identify. Sarah made careful notes about the extent of the damage, calculating costs in her head, and trying not to think about how quickly this project was going to consume her savings. But it was when she returned to the first floor, making her way toward the back of the house, that Sarah discovered the room that would change everything, the ballroom. She'd saved it for last, drawn by the architectural drawings she'd found in the county records. The listing had mentioned it, a grand ballroom with 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. The space was breathtaking, even in decay. The ceiling soared overhead, decorated with elaborate plasterwork that depicted clouds and cherubs. 3 enormous crystal chandeliers hung in a row, their chains thick with rust, but their crystals still intact. The walls were panels of rich wood, interspersed with mirrors now foxed and spotted with age. And the windows, 12 enormous windows, each 8 feet tall, faced the back gardens, their glass miraculously unbroken despite a century of neglect. But it was the floor that captured Sarah's attention. The hardwood parquet, though damaged and warped in places from water infiltration, was a masterpiece of inlaid wood. Patterns of oak, walnut, and cherry formed geometric designs that must have been stunning when new. Sarah walked slowly across it, her flashlight beam revealing the craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. And then she saw it. Near the center of the room, the pattern was wrong. A rectangular section, approximately 6 feet by 4 feet, showed a distinctly different wood grain and coloring. The boards were slightly warped in a different direction, as if they'd been cut out and replaced at some point after the original floor was laid. Sarah knelt, running her fingers along the edges of the rectangle. The joints were tight, professional work, but definitely not original to the floor. The wood grain didn't match. The aging pattern was subtly different. Someone had cut out this section and patched it with wood from a different source. Her architect's mind immediately began calculating reasons: water damage from above. But there was no corresponding stain on the ceiling, and the ceiling itself showed no signs of repair. Structural damage to the floor system beneath. Possible, but the repair seemed too precise, too carefully done for an emergency fix. She retrieved her pry bar from her toolkit. The sensible thing would be to wait, to bring in a structural engineer, to proceed carefully. But Sarah had spent 3 years being sensible, being careful, letting her ex-husband make the decisions, because he was the builder, the one with experience. And where had that gotten her? The first board came up with surprising ease, as if it had been removed before. Beneath the hardwood was the original subfloor, also clearly cut and replaced. Sarah removed several more boards, creating an opening about 2 feet square. Her flashlight beam revealed something that made no sense. Concrete, a thick cap of poured concrete, smooth and deliberately finished, lay beneath the subfloor where there should have been nothing but joists and the crawl space below. Victorian homes of this era didn't use concrete in their flooring systems. This had been added later, much later, based on the pore marks and the type of concrete, deliberately sealing off whatever lay beneath the ballroom floor. Sarah sat back, her mind racing through possibilities. A structural repair. But why concrete? And why so thick? She estimated 7 or 8 inches at least. A foundation fix. But the rest of the house showed no signs of foundation problems. And why only here, in this specific spot? Someone had gone to considerable effort and expense to seal something beneath this floor. Something they wanted to ensure stayed buried. The rational part of her brain, the part trained in engineering and construction, insisted there must be a logical explanation. A cistern that had been filled in. An old well. Some feature of the original construction that had been capped for safety. But the irrational part, the part that had noticed how the auction attendees fled, that remembered the elderly man's warning, that had felt the weight of a century of abandonment, that part whispered something else. This wasn't a repair. This was a seal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon had faded to early evening. By the time Sarah finished her initial survey of the property, she'd compiled pages of notes: roof repairs needed immediately, extensive water damage in the east wing, all windows requiring restoration or replacement, the collapsed chimney on the north side, outdated or non-existent utilities throughout. But her mind kept returning to that concrete cap beneath the ballroom floor. She'd replaced the boards carefully, but the knowledge of what lay beneath them sat heavy in her thoughts. In 10 years as an architect, specializing in historic preservation, she'd worked on dozens of old buildings. She'd found all manner of surprises: original wallpaper hidden under layers of paint, forgotten rooms sealed behind false walls, secret passages built during the Underground Railroad era, even a collection of Prohibition-era liquor bottles hidden in a chimney. But she'd never encountered anything like this. The deliberate sealing of a space with that much concrete spoke to something beyond simple renovation or repair. It suggested concealment. It suggested something that needed to stay hidden. As darkness fell, Sarah set up her temporary camp in what had been the library, a first-floor room with built-in bookshelves still filled with moldering volumes. The room was structurally sound, had minimal water damage, and crucially had a working fireplace where she could build a fire to ward off the October chill. She'd brought camping supplies for exactly this scenario: a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable camp stove, a cooler with food and water for 3 days, battery-powered lights, and her laptop with a portable charger. The utilities wouldn't be reconnected for at least a week, assuming the infrastructure could even support them. Until then, she'd be roughing it. The fire caught quickly, fed by wood from the carriage house that had dried for decades. As warmth spread through the room and shadows danced on the walls, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching the property's history. The internet connection on her phone was weak but functional, and she'd learned over the years how to mine historical records online. She started with the basic property records, then branched out into newspaper archives, historical societies, and genealogical databases. Whitmore Estate had been built in 1889 by Jonathan Whitmore, an industrialist who'd made his fortune in textile mills along the Connecticut River. The construction had taken 3 years and had been documented extensively in local newspapers of the era, which marveled at the estate's grandeur and modern amenities: indoor plumbing, gas lighting, central heating, a ballroom designed for 200 guests. For 3 decades, the estate had been the social center of Millbrook. The digitized society pages Sarah found chronicled an endless parade of dinner parties, charity galas, holiday celebrations, and summer lawn parties. The Whitmore name appeared repeatedly, often alongside other prominent families: the Ashfords, the Montgomerys, the Prescotts, the Van Burens. These families owned the mills, the banks, the major businesses. They sat on town councils and charitable boards. They were, in every sense, Millbrook's founding families. Jonathan Whitmore had married in 1886, and his wife Eleanor had been a fixture in the society columns, always described as gracious, charitable, elegant. They'd had 1 child, a daughter named Catherine, born in 1892. Sarah found photographs from various archives. Jonathan Whitmore in his prime, a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and intense eyes, always photographed in formal attire. Eleanor, softer, with the elaborate hairstyles and corseted gowns of the era, and Catherine, captured at various ages. A child in a white dress with ribbons, a teenager in riding clothes, a young woman at her coming-out ball. The estate had been at its peak in the early 1920s. Even during World War I, the Whitmores had continued their social obligations, hosting fundraisers for the war effort and welcome home celebrations for returning soldiers. The newspaper accounts painted a picture of a family at the center of their community, respected and influential. Then, in October 1924, everything stopped. Sarah searched for specific dates, narrowing her focus to the fall of that year. The society columns continued through September, mentioning the Whitmores hosting a harvest celebration and Catherine Whitmore's engagement announcement to Preston Montgomery, son of another prominent family. Then nothing. No party announcements for October, no society mentions, no business dealings noted in the commercial pages. It was as if the Whitmore family had simply been erased from the public record overnight. Sarah widened her search, looking for any mention of the family after October 1924. What she found was frustrating in its vagueness. A few oblique references in other families' social announcements, mentions of the recent tragedy or the unfortunate events at Whitmore Estate. One brief notation in a town council meeting from November 1924 about addressing public concern regarding the Whitmore situation, but no details, no specifics, just careful, deliberate silence. She found Jonathan Whitmore's death certificate eventually, dated 1925, a full year after the estate had been abandoned. He'd died in a sanitarium in upstate New York. The cause of death listed simply as nervous disorder. Eleanor's death certificate was from 1927 in a similar facility. Both had died in institutions, far from Millbrook, far from their grand estate. But Catherine, their daughter, who would have been 32 in 1924, had no death certificate Sarah could find. The engagement announcement had been in early September. The wedding had been planned for November, but there was no marriage announcement, no birth announcements of children, no society mentions. Catherine Whitmore had simply vanished from the record. The Montgomery family, Preston's family, the would-be grooms continued to appear in the newspapers. Preston had married someone else in 1926. His parents had remained prominent in town affairs, but none of them ever appeared in connection with the Whitmore estate again. At midnight, Sarah finally found something more concrete, a brief article from a Boston newspaper dated November 15, 1924. It was in the news from nearby town section, easily missed. Millbrook tragedy remains shrouded in mystery. Authorities in the quiet Connecticut town of Millbrook continue to decline comment on the disturbing events at Whitmore Estate last month. While local residents speak of the incident in hushed tones, officials have released no formal statement beyond confirming that an investigation is ongoing. The estate, once the crown jewel of Millbrook society, remains unoccupied, and the Whitmore family has not been seen in public since the incident. Several prominent local families have declined to speak with this reporter, citing the sensitive nature of the situation. That was it. No follow-up articles, no resolution, just silence, as complete and absolute as the abandonment of the estate itself. Sarah leaned back, the fire crackling beside her, and tried to piece together what she knew. A prominent family at the height of their social influence, a tragedy of some kind in October 1924, the immediate abandonment of the estate, the parents institutionalized, speaking of nervous disorders, the daughter disappeared entirely, and a century of silence from everyone in Millbrook who might know what really happened. And beneath the ballroom floor, a thick cap of concrete, deliberately sealing something that 4 generations had agreed should stay buried. She pulled up a map of Millbrook on her laptop, studying the town's layout. The Whitmore Estate sat on the northern edge of town, isolated on its 12 acres. But it wasn't far from other historic properties. Within a 2-mile radius were several grand homes that, according to property records, still belonged to descendants of those same founding families mentioned in the old society pages. The Ashfords, Montgomerys, Prescotts, Van Burens, all still prominent in Millbrook, all still living in or near the same properties their families had occupied a century ago. These families would know, they must know, whatever had happened here had involved their ancestors perhaps directly. The careful silence, maintained across 4 generations, suggested coordination, suggested a shared secret so terrible that exposing it would damage not just one family's reputation, but the entire social structure of Millbrook's elite. Sarah's mother had been right when she'd said, people in Millbrook don't talk about the Whitmore Estate. But they knew, they all knew, and they'd collectively decided that whatever had happened here should remain buried. The question was whether Sarah was willing to unearth it. She could ignore it, focus on the renovation, restore the mansion to its former glory, convert it into the inn or event space she'd planned. The concrete cap could stay in place. The ballroom floor could be refinished over it. No one needed to know what lay beneath. But Sarah had spent 3 years ignoring things. Ignoring her ex-husband's dismissive treatment of her career. Ignoring the way his family looked down on her middle-class background. Ignoring her own instincts about the marriage until it was too late. She'd played it safe, been sensible, and ended up divorced, broke, and starting over at 29. Maybe it was time to stop ignoring things. The fire had burned down to embers when Sarah finally crawled into her sleeping bag. The house creaked and settled around her, sounds amplified by a century of silence and emptiness. Wind rattled the windows. Rain continued its steady percussion on the roof. Somewhere in the depths of the house, something, a door, a shutter, banged rhythmically. But louder than any of those sounds was the question that echoed through Sarah's mind as she drifted toward an uneasy sleep. What was sealed beneath the ballroom floor in October 1924? And why had an entire town spent 100 years ensuring it stayed hidden? Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would begin finding out. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the library windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the cold air. Sarah woke stiff and disoriented, her breath visible in the frigid room. The fire had died completely during the night, and the October chill had seeped into every corner of the house. She checked her phone, 7:23 a.m., and a string of missed calls from her mother. Sarah sent a quick text, "I'm fine. House is a project but manageable. We'll call later." She couldn't face her mother's concern yet, couldn't admit that she'd spent the night in a sleeping bag, researching a century-old tragedy instead of planning the practical renovation work she should be focused on. After a breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee heated on her camp stove, Sarah stood in the ballroom doorway, staring at the section of floor she'd disturbed the previous day. In the morning light, the patched rectangle seemed even more obvious, almost accusatory. She'd replaced the boards last night, but she hadn't been able to stop thinking about what lay beneath them. The rational choice would be to leave it alone, call in contractors, focus on the roof and the water damage and the 1,000 other problems this house presented. Forget about the concrete cap and the mystery it represented. But Sarah had never been good at leaving mysteries alone. It was what had made her a good architect, the obsessive need to understand why buildings were designed the way they were, what choices had been made and why. And this building was screaming questions at her that she couldn't ignore. She needed tools, heavy-duty tools. The pry bar and hammer from her basic toolkit wouldn't be enough to break through 7 inches of concrete. She needed a jackhammer, or at minimum a sledgehammer, and chisel, and she needed to do this properly, which meant understanding what she might be getting into. Sarah spent the morning exploring the rest of the estate's outbuildings, documenting damage and looking for anything useful. The carriage house was a loss. The roof had partially collapsed, and everything inside was ruined by weather and rot. But the old gardener's shed, a small stone structure she'd almost missed behind overgrown lilac bushes, proved more promising. The door was swollen shut, but Sarah managed to force it open with her pry bar. Inside, remarkably well preserved, due to the stone construction and tight-fitting door, was a collection of old tools: shovels, picks, a sledgehammer with a weathered wooden handle, chisels of various sizes, even an old manual post-hole digger. Everything was rusty but serviceable. More importantly, she found a set of metal shelves holding glass jars of nails, screws and other hardware, all carefully labeled in faded handwriting, and on the bottom shelf, pushed far back and covered in decades of dust, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. Sarah pulled it out carefully. The box was well made, dovetailed corners with a small brass latch. It wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were several items: a leather journal, yellowed with age, a collection of photographs, and a large brass key on a ring. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal. The handwriting inside was neat, precise, and belonged to someone educated. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1924. Father has asked me to keep a record of what is happening. He says that if things go wrong, someone should know the truth. I don't fully understand what he means, but I've agreed. Mother seems more worried each day, though she tries to hide it from me. The wedding is still planned for November 14th, but Preston has been distant lately. Father says it's just nerves, but I'm not certain. The entry was signed Sid W. Catherine Whitmore. Sarah's heart raced as she carefully turned the brittle pages. The journal continued through late September and into October, documenting what appeared to be growing tension within the household and the broader Millbrook society. September 28, 1924. Father had another terrible argument with Mr. Ashford and Mr. Van Buren today. I heard shouting from his study. When I asked what was wrong, Father said only that some men value money more than honor. He's been spending long hours in the ballroom, overseeing some kind of construction work. He won't tell me what it is, says it's necessary precautions. The mother cries when she thinks no one can hear. October 3rd, 1924. Preston came to call today, but Father refused to see him. This is unbearable. My fiancé turned away at our own door. When I confronted Father, he said the engagement may need to be reconsidered, that the Montgomery family cannot be trusted. He said something about protecting what matters and insurance against treachery. I don't understand any of this. October 12th, 1924. Workers finished their project in the ballroom today. Father had them seal something beneath the floor. I saw them pouring concrete, heard him giving very specific instructions about thickness and curing time. When I asked what they were doing, he said I would understand soon enough. He's been meeting with lawyers from Boston, men I don't recognize. Everything feels wrong. Sarah flipped through more pages, the entries growing increasingly agitated and confused. Catherine wrote about her father's paranoia, her mother's deteriorating mental state, the way their social circle had seemingly turned against them. Then came the final entry, dated October 24th, 1924. I know what father hid beneath the ballroom floor. I know what he's been protecting. I know why the others want him to destroy it. And I know that tonight, at the planned dinner party, something terrible is going to happen. Father believes he can use what he's hidden to force the truth into the open, to make the others confess. But I've heard Preston and his father talking. They have no intention of confessing anything. They're going to... The entry ended abruptly, the final sentence unfinished, as if Catherine had been interrupted mid-writing. There were no more entries after that date. Sarah sat in the dusty shed, the journal trembling in her hands, trying to process what she'd read. Catherine's words painted a picture of a family caught in some kind of conflict with Millbrook's other elite families. Jonathan Whitmore had hidden something beneath the ballroom floor, something valuable enough to use as leverage, something the other families wanted destroyed. He'd planned a dinner party, presumably to confront them with whatever evidence he possessed. And then everything had stopped. The estate had been abandoned, the parents had been institutionalized. Catherine had vanished from all records. What had happened at that dinner party? Sarah examined the photographs in the box. Most showed the estate in its prime, the gardens in full bloom, the mansion's exterior pristine and white formal gatherings on the lawn. But 3 photographs were different. They showed the ballroom, and in one corner of each image, partially visible, was what appeared to be a large safe or strongbox before the floor had been sealed over it. The brass key in the box was old, ornate, and unlike any modern key Sarah had seen. It was approximately 4 inches long, with an elaborate bow featuring engraved initials, JW. The bit was complex, suggesting it opened something more sophisticated than a simple door lock. This key, Sarah realized with growing certainty, opened whatever Jonathan Whitmore had sealed beneath the ballroom floor. She gathered the journal, photographs, and key, along with the sledgehammer and chisels from the shed, and returned to the house. The morning had given way to afternoon, grey clouds promising more rain. Sarah knew she should be practical, should focus on the immediate structural needs of the building. But Catherine Whitmore's unfinished sentence echoed in her mind. They're going to what? And what had actually happened that night in October 1924. The only way to find answers was to break through that concrete seal. Before we continue with what Sarah discovered, let me know in the comments if you're enjoying this story. And make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's conclusion is going to reveal secrets that have been buried for a century. Sarah spent the next hour clearing furniture from the ballroom, pushing everything to the walls to give herself maximum workspace. The afternoon light through the tall windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the patched rectangle stand out even more starkly. She used her pry bar to remove a larger section of the hardwood and subfloor, creating an opening about 4 feet square, directly over the concrete cap. The concrete was thick, professionally poured, and remarkably well preserved. Someone had known exactly what they were doing when they'd sealed this space. Sarah positioned herself with the sledgehammer, aimed at the center of the concrete cap, and swung hard. The impact jarred her arms and shoulders, sending vibrations up through her bones. A small crack appeared in the concrete. She swung again and again. Each impact widened the crack, small chips breaking away. It took nearly an hour of sustained effort before she'd created a hole large enough to see through. Exhausted, Sarah set down the sledgehammer and grabbed her high-powered flashlight, kneeling at the edge of the opening. The flashlight beam revealed a chamber beneath the ballroom floor, approximately 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, and 6 feet wide. It had been deliberately constructed, lined with brick on all sides, with a wooden ceiling that supported the floor joists. This wasn't a natural cavity or an accidental space. Someone had built this chamber specifically to hide something. And in that chamber, still intact after a century, was exactly what the photographs had shown. A large Victorian-era safe, standing about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, made of heavy iron, with ornate brass fittings. Sarah's breath caught. Jonathan Whitmore had literally buried his safe beneath the ballroom floor, then sealed it with concrete to ensure it stayed hidden. The effort involved excavating the chamber, installing the safe, constructing the brick walls, pouring the concrete cap, represented a massive undertaking. Whatever was in that safe had been worth extraordinary measures to protect. She worked for another 2 hours, carefully enlarging the hole in the concrete until it was wide enough for her to climb through. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah finally lowered herself into the hidden chamber, her boots finding purchase on the brick floor. The air in the chamber was stale, but surprisingly dry. The brick walls showed no signs of moisture damage, suggesting the construction had been done with considerable skill. Sarah's flashlight beam played across the safe, revealing more details. The door was ornate, featuring a painted landscape scene, a pastoral image of rolling hills, and a distant manor house. The safe's manufacturer plate read Victor Safe and Lock Company, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1889. The same year the estate had been built. Jonathan Whitmore had purchased this safe as part of the original construction, then spent 35 years using it before deciding it needed to be hidden, so thoroughly that only someone with extraordinary determination would ever find it. The safe had 2 keyholes, one in the center of the door, one at the bottom left corner. Sarah examined them closely. The center keyhole appeared to be for the main lock, while the bottom one might be for a secondary security mechanism. She withdrew the brass key from her pocket, the one she'd found in Catherine's pocket, clicked perfectly into the main lock. But when Sarah tried to turn it, nothing happened. Nothing happened. The key turned freely, but the safe door remained locked. She tried the bottom keyhole. The key didn't fit. She examined the safe more carefully, running her hands around the edges, looking for any other mechanism or lock. Then she noted something odd. The painted landscape scene on the safe door wasn't just decorative. It appeared to be slightly raised, as if it might move. Sarah pressed it gently until it so that it slightly. Of course, a safe of this quality and era would have multiple security features. The key alone wasn't enough. She needed the combination as well. Sarah climbed back out of the chamber, her mind racing. Where would Jonathan Whitmore have hidden the combination? She thought about Catherine's journal entries, the careful documentation of her father's behavior in those final weeks. He'd been paranoid, worried about betrayal, taking elaborate precautions. He wouldn't have written the combination down anywhere obvious, but he also wouldn't have trusted it solely to memory, not if he was planning to use the safe's contents as leverage against the other families. He'd need to be certain he could access it when needed. Sarah returned to the library where she'd made camp, pulling out Catherine's journal again. She read through every entry carefully, looking for any mention of numbers, dates or sequences that might be significant. One entry caught her attention, from October 15th, 1924. Father has been obsessed with the date of the original agreement. He keeps saying they need to remember what they signed, when they signed it, what they promised. He has the document, he says. The proof of their conspiracy. September 9th, 1889. The day this all began. September 9th, 1889. The same year the estate and safe had been manufactured, and possibly the combination, September 9th, 89, or some variation thereof. Sarah grabbed the journal and returned to the ballroom, lowering herself back into the chamber. She rotated the painted panel to reveal the combination dial, then carefully turned it right to 9, left to 9, right to 89. She tried variations, September 9th, 89, September 9th, 89, September 9th, 89. Each attempt ended with the same result. The lock didn't release. Frustrated, Sarah sat on the brick floor of the chamber, thinking. Jonathan Whitmore had been careful, methodical. The safe had been buried in 1924, but it had been purchased in 1889. What if the combination itself was from 1889, set when the safe was first installed? She tried again, 1889, still nothing. Then she remembered something else from the journal. Catherine had mentioned her parents' wedding anniversary multiple times. They'd celebrated their 38th anniversary in August 1924. That would put their wedding in 1886. And Catherine's birth had been in 1892. Sarah tried 1886, then 1892. Neither worked. She was about to give up for the night, when another detail from the journal surfaced in her memory. Catherine had written about her father's obsession with the original agreement and what they signed, not when the estate was built, but when some agreement had been made. What if September 9th, 1889 wasn't the date of the estate's construction, but the date of some other significant event? And what if the combination wasn't a date at all, but related to something else Jonathan Whitmore would have considered important? Sarah climbed out of the chamber once more and retrieved her laptop. Working by flashlight in the dying afternoon sun, she searched historical records for anything significant about September 9th, 1889, in Millbrook, Connecticut. It took nearly an hour of searching through digitized newspaper archives, but she finally found a brief announcement in the Millbrook Gazette from September 12, 1889. Business alliance formed. 5 of Millbrook's leading industrialists have formalized a business alliance for the mutual benefit of their enterprises and the town's continued prosperity. Jonathan Whitmore, Whitmore Textiles, Harrison Ashford, Ashford Mills, Edmund Montgomery, First Bank of Millbrook, Charles Van Buren, Van Buren Manufacturing, and Silas Prescott, Prescott Shipping, signed the agreement on September 9th at Whitmore Estate. The alliance, which includes profit-sharing arrangements and coordinated business strategies, is expected to ensure Millbrook's position as a leading industrial center in Connecticut. There it was, September 9th, 1889, an agreement between 5 families signed at Whitmore Estate. The same 5 families whose names had appeared repeatedly in Sarah's research, whose descendants still controlled much of Millbrook's economy and society. But Sarah noticed something else in the article. The date of publication was September 12th, but the agreement had been signed on September 9th, 3 days earlier, which meant the article had been written shortly after the signing. What if the combination wasn't just the date, but something else related to that agreement? The number of signatories, 5. The number of families involved, also 5. Sarah tried May 9th, 1889, nothing. Then September 5th, 89, still nothing. She was missing something. Catherine's journal had mentioned that her father kept saying the others needed to remember what they signed, not when, but what. The content of the agreement itself. Sarah searched for more information about the 1889 Business Alliance, but found nothing else in the newspaper archives. The agreement itself would have been a private document, not published in the papers. But if Jonathan Whitmore had hidden a copy in the safe, if that was the proof Catherine had mentioned, then he would have wanted a combination that referenced the agreement in a way the other families would understand. She thought about Victorian business practices. Profit-sharing agreements typically specified percentages. What if the combination was related to profit percentages? With 5 families involved, an equal split would be 20% each. Sarah tried 20-20-20. Too many numbers for the dial, which only went to 100. What if it was a total? 5 families, 20% each, would total 100. She tried 5-20-100. Nothing. Exhausted and frustrated, Sarah decided to try one more approach. She examined the safe itself more carefully in the flashlight beam. The manufacturer plate read Victor Safe and Lock Company, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1889. Below that was a serial number, V35874. What if the combination was the serial number? She tried 35874. Still nothing. Then she noticed something else. Engraved very faintly on the bottom right corner of the safe door, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, were 4 numbers, 1889. Just 1889. Not a full date, not an obvious code, but if you knew what you were looking for, if you understood the reference, 1889, the year of the agreement, and 18, what? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. 18 families, no, there were only 5. 18%, 18 people. Then it hit her. She pulled out her phone and searched for the population of Millbrook in 1889. The census data showed 1,847 residents. She tried 1847. 2 digits wouldn't work on a multi-digit combination. But what if it wasn't the full population, but something specific about that year? She searched more carefully through the historical records, looking for anything significant about 1889 in Millbrook. Finally, she found a town council report from that year, documenting the number of mill workers employed by the 5 companies, 1,834. The combination was staring her in the face. 1889, the year, 1834, the workers whose labor had built these men's fortunes. Sarah's hands were shaking as she positioned herself in front of the safe once more. She rotated the dial carefully right to 18, left to 34, right to 89. She heard a click deep inside the mechanism, then another. The lock released. Sarah turned the brass key, and with a grinding of metal that hadn't moved in a century, the heavy door swung open. The interior of the safe was divided into compartments and shelves, all still intact. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed stacks of documents, several small wooden boxes, a collection of what appeared to be financial ledgers, and most prominent on the top shelf, a large leather-bound book secured with a metal clasp. Sarah reached for the leather book first, carefully lifting it from the shelf. Dust cascaded from its surface, making her cough. The clasp released easily, and she opened the cover. The Millbrook Compact was written in ornate script on the first page. An agreement of mutual benefit and shared enterprise entered into this 9th day of September, Anno Domini, 1889, by and between the undersigned parties. What followed was a detailed legal document, written in the formal language of the era, outlining an agreement between the 5 families. But as Sarah read through it by flashlight, she realized this wasn't just a simple business alliance. The document described a coordinated system for controlling Millbrook's economy, politics, and society. The 5 families agreed to fix wages across all their enterprises, to prevent workers from seeking better pay, coordinate prices, to prevent competition among themselves, control property ownership by only selling land to approved parties, manipulate local government by ensuring only their chosen candidates won elections, prevent the formation of labor unions through any necessary means, share profits from all enterprises according to a predetermined percentage, maintain absolute secrecy about the compact's existence. The final clause was particularly chilling. Should any party to this compact reveal its existence or terms to any outside party, that party forfeits all rights and benefits herein, and the remaining parties are bound to take all necessary actions to protect the compact's secrecy, including but not limited to the acquisition of the violating party's assets and properties. It was a conspiracy to control an entire town, written down and signed by 5 men who'd built their fortunes on the labor of workers they were systematically exploiting, and the signatures were all there at the bottom, in faded ink. Jonathan Whitmore, Harrison Ashford, Edmund Montgomery, Charles Van Buren, and Silas Prescott. But there was something else, a series of amendments added over the years, each signed and dated. Sarah flipped through them, her horror growing. An 1897 amendment described the relocation of workers who tried to organize a strike, with specific notes about accidents arranged at the mills. A 1903 amendment outlined the manipulation of a town election, including bribes paid to the vote counter. A 1911 amendment discussed the foreclosure on properties belonging to families who'd supported labor reform, with notes about falsified loan documents. And there at the end was a final amendment dated August 15, 1924, just 2 months before the estate had been abandoned. Jonathan Whitmore, having expressed moral objections to the continuation of certain practices outlined in previous amendments, and having threatened to reveal the existence of this compact to state authorities, is hereby designated as a liability to the continued operation of the Millbrook Compact. The remaining parties agree that Whitmore's participation is no longer desired, and that his removal from the compact, along with the acquisition of his assets and the silencing of his family, will be accomplished by whatever means necessary. This action to be completed no later than November 1924. It was a death warrant, signed by 4 of Millbrook's most prominent families, plotted against the 5th. Sarah sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by a century-old conspiracy, holding evidence of industrial exploitation, political corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. This was what Jonathan Whitmore had hidden beneath his ballroom floor. This was what he planned to reveal at the dinner party in October 1924. This was what had caused his family's destruction and 100 years of silence. She began examining the other contents of the safe. The wooden boxes contained gold coins, a small fortune even then, perhaps Jonathan Whitmore's escape fund. The ledgers documented decades of the compact's operations in meticulous detail: wage-fixing schemes, bribed officials sabotaged competitors, workers who'd suffered accidents, and in a separate, smaller compartment, Sarah found a stack of photographs. Unlike the formal family portraits she'd seen in the archives, these were candid, almost surveillance-like. They showed meetings between the 5 families, documents being signed, money changing hands, and one photograph, dated October 24, 1924, showed 4 men standing in the Whitmore Estate ballroom, looking at what appeared to be an excavation in the floor. The chamber Sarah was currently. The photographs note, in Jonathan Whitmore's handwriting, read no stain value. They came tonight, as I expect. I showed them the chamber, told them the documents are sealed inside, and that I've made arrangements for their release to authorities if anything happens to me or my family. They don't believe me. God help us. That had been his final mistake. Jonathan Whitmore had thought he could use the evidence as a shield, that the threat of exposure would protect him, but he'd underestimated how far the other families would go to protect their secret. Sarah checked her phone. It was after 8 p.m. and her mother had called 3 more times. She climbed out of the chamber, her body aching from the hours of work, her mind reeling from what she'd discovered. She had evidence of a century-old conspiracy that had destroyed one family and controlled an entire town. Evidence that the descendants of those same families who still lived in Millbrook, who still held positions of power and influence, would presumably want to keep buried. Catherine Whitmore's journal had ended with an unfinished sentence. "They're going to..." Now Sarah knew what had happened next. Jonathan Whitmore had tried to force a confession by threatening exposure. The other families had called his bluff. And on the night of October 24th, 1924, something had happened that had destroyed the Whitmore family so thoroughly that even 100 years later, the entire town stayed silent about it. Sarah needed to decide what to do with this information. She could reseal the chamber, pretend she'd never found it, focus on her renovation project. The safe choice, or she could do what Jonathan Whitmore had tried to do a century ago, bring the truth into the light, regardless of the consequences. As Sarah stood in the ballroom, looking at the hole she'd broken through the concrete seal, her phone finally rang. Not her mother this time, but an unknown local number. She answered warily. "Hello? Miss Brennan?" The voice was elderly, male, and spoke with the careful enunciation of old New England wealth. "This is Harrison Ashford III. I believe we should talk about the property you've acquired. I'd like to offer you a very generous sum for it, enough to solve your financial troubles and allow you to relocate somewhere more suitable for your ambitions." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd been in the house less than 48 hours, had told no one except her mother about breaking through the seal, had been completely alone. How did he know? "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Ashford," she said carefully. There was a pause. "Miss Brennan, you're new to Millbrook. You don't understand its complexities. Some properties carry burdens that aren't immediately apparent. The Whitmore Estate is one of them. I'm trying to help you avoid a very unpleasant situation." "What kind of situation?" Another pause. Longer this time. "The kind that befalls people who discover things that are better left buried. The kind that happened to the Whitmore family 100 years ago. We've worked very hard to maintain peace and prosperity in this town, Miss Brennan. I'd hate to see you become an obstacle to that peace." The line went dead. Sarah stood alone in the darkening ballroom, the broken concrete seal at her feet, a century of secrets in a safe beneath the floor, and the clear understanding that the same families who destroyed the Whitmores were still watching, still protecting their conspiracy, and they knew she'd found something. Sarah stood motionless in the darkening ballroom, her phone still warm from Harrison Ashford's threatening call. The silence of the house pressed against her ears, broken only by the sound of her own racing heartbeat. They were watching her. Somehow, despite being alone on this isolated property, the descendants of the compact families knew she'd broken through the seal. She forced herself to think logically. The property had been abandoned for a century, but that didn't mean it was unmonitored. There could be cameras, motion sensors, any number of surveillance methods that would alert interested parties to activity at the estate. The families who'd spent 100 years keeping this secret buried would have taken precautions. Sarah walked slowly through the house, examining windows and door frames with her flashlight, looking for anything that seemed out of place or recently installed. In the entrance hall, she found it, a small device mounted in the decorative molding near the ceiling, so discreet she'd never have noticed it if she hadn't been looking. A camera, wireless, probably battery-powered, with a lens no bigger than a pinhead. Her stomach turned. How many were there? She found 3 more on the first floor alone, positioned to cover the main rooms. Someone had been watching this property, waiting to see if anyone would ever discover the hidden chamber. And now they knew she had. Sarah returned to the ballroom and carefully photographed everything: the broken concrete seal, the chamber below, and most importantly, the safe and its contents. She used her phone to document every page of the Millbrook compact, every amendment, every incriminating photograph. The evidence was too important to risk losing. She uploaded everything to a secure cloud storage account, then sent copies to 3 different email addresses she created on the spot. Only then did she allow herself to feel the fear that had been building since Ashford's call. She was alone in an isolated mansion, miles from the nearest neighbor, in a town controlled by families who'd proven a century ago that they were willing to destroy anyone who threatened their secret. The same families who still wielded enormous power and influence. She needed help. But who could she trust in a town where the Ashfords, Montgomerys, Prescotts and Van Burns controlled the banks, the businesses, the local government? Sarah called her mother, keeping her voice steady. "Mum, I need you to do something for me. Don't ask questions right now. Just listen." "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound..." "Mum, please. I need you to contact Professor Ellen Whitfield at Boston University, the history department. Tell her I've found primary source documents related to industrial corruption in Connecticut in the 1890s through 1920s. Tell her it's urgent and I need her expertise immediately. Can you do that?" Her mother's silence stretched for several seconds. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What have you gotten into?" "I'll explain everything, I promise. But right now I just need you to make that call. And Mom, don't mention where I am or what property I bought. Just say I'm working on a restoration project and found some interesting historical documents. Please." "All right. I'll call her first thing in the morning. But Sarah, if you're in danger..." "I'm fine. Just making sure I handle this properly. I love you." Sarah ended the call before her mother could ask more questions. Professor Whitfield had been one of her mentors in college before Sarah had switched from history to architecture. She was an expert in labor history and industrial corruption, and more importantly, she had connections with investigative journalists and legal historians. If anyone could help navigate what Sarah had found, it was Whitfield. But morning was hours away. Sarah needed to secure the evidence physically, not just digitally. She couldn't risk leaving it in the safe. If the families knew she'd found the chamber, they might come tonight to destroy everything. She spent the next hour carefully removing everything from the safe and bringing it up to the library where she'd made camp. The compact document, the ledgers, the photographs, the gold coins, all of it came up through the hole in the ballroom floor. She packed it carefully in boxes, wrapped in plastic sheeting she'd found in the gardener's shed. Then Sarah did something that felt paranoid but necessary. She hid the boxes in 3 separate locations around the property. One in the attic of the carriage house, beneath rotting hay bales. One buried in the greenhouse, under broken pots and dead soil, and one in the cellar of the main house, which she finally forced open, placing it behind a collapsed wine rack. The compact document itself she kept with her, sealed in a waterproof bag in her backpack. If she needed to run, that was the most important piece of evidence. By midnight, exhausted and running on adrenaline, Sarah tried to sleep, but every creak of the old house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent her bolt upright with her flashlight, certain that someone was coming. At 2:47 a.m. she heard it, not the random sounds of an old building settling, but the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle was coming up the driveway. Sarah grabbed her backpack and moved quickly to a second-floor window that overlooked the front of the property. Through the darkness, she could make out a black sedan, headlights off, rolling slowly toward the house. It stopped about 50 yards away, and three figures emerged. They carried flashlights and what looked like equipment cases. Sarah's breath caught as she watched them approach the house, moving with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this before. They weren't trying the front door. Instead, they headed around to the side entrance, the one that led to the servants' quarters and kitchen. Sarah heard the sound of a lock being picked, then the creak of a door opening. They were inside. She moved silently down the back staircase, the one servants would have used, staying in the shadows. From her position, she could hear voices echoing through the empty house. The ballroom. Check the ballroom first. Jesus, she really did break through. How much do you think she found? Doesn't matter. We clean it out, seal it back up, make it look like nothing was ever here. Boss wants this done before dawn. Sarah's hand tightened on her backpack. They were here to destroy the evidence, to bury the secret again. She couldn't confront three men in the middle of the night in an isolated mansion. She needed to get out, get to safety, and then decide what to do with what she'd found. She slipped out through the library's French doors, which opened onto the back terrace. The October night was cold and dark, clouds obscuring the moon. Sarah moved quickly across the overgrown back lawn, heading for the tree line at the edge of the property. Behind her, she heard a shout from inside the house. They discovered the safe was empty. Sarah ran. The woods behind the estate were dense, the ground uneven and treacherous in the darkness. Branches caught at her clothes and scratched her face. She used her phone's flashlight sparingly, just enough to avoid running into trees, praying they wouldn't see the brief flashes of light. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Sarah emerged onto a road, not the main driveway, but a service road that ran along the back edge of the property. She oriented herself, realized she was about a mile from the main road, and started walking quickly, keeping to the shadows. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We know you took them. Return the documents, and we can discuss a reasonable settlement. Continue this foolishness, and you'll regret it." Sarah kept walking, her mind racing. She needed somewhere safe to go, somewhere the compact families couldn't reach her. But where? Every hotel in Millbrook would have connections to the families who controlled the town. The police. They'd probably been on the compact's payroll for generations. She thought about Catherine Whitmore's journal, the last entry cut short. They're going to what had happened to Catherine, what had happened to her parents. The official story was institutionalization, but was that the truth? Or had the compact families made them disappear more permanently? Sarah reached the main road just as another vehicle approached. She ducked behind a tree, watching as a second black sedan cruised slowly past, clearly searching for her. They weren't giving up. She needed a plan, fast. Sarah pulled out her phone and composed an email to Professor Whitfield, not waiting for her mother's call. "Professor, this is Sarah Brennan from your 2019 American Industrial History Seminar. I've discovered documents relating to industrial corruption and labor exploitation in Connecticut from 1889 to 1924. The evidence is substantial and involves prominent families who still have significant power. I need help immediately. I'm attaching digital copies of the key documents. If anything happens to me, please ensure these reach appropriate authorities and media outlets. The physical originals are hidden in 3 locations on the Whitmore Estate property in Millbrook, Connecticut. She attached the photos she'd taken and hit send, then sent similar emails to 2 investigative journalists whose work she'd followed, and to a law professor at Yale who specialized in historical justice cases. If the compact families wanted to silence her, at least the evidence would survive. The sound of the sedan returning made Sarah move deeper into the woods, parallel to the road. She needed to put distance between herself and the estate, but she also needed to stay hidden until morning, when she could find somewhere public and safe. She walked for an hour, following the road from within the tree line, until she reached the outskirts of Millbrook proper. The town was dark and silent, its New England charm sinister in the pre-dawn gloom. Sarah found a 24-hour diner, a small miracle in a town this size, and slipped inside. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced up from her magazine. "Coffee, please, and do you have Wi-Fi? Passwords on the board. Kitchen's open if you want food." Sarah ordered pancakes she had no appetite for, and settled into a corner booth, where she could watch the door. She pulled out her laptop and began researching the current status of the compact families. Harrison Ashford III, who'd called her, was the president of Ashford Manufacturing, the modern incarnation of the original textile mills. The company now produced high-end fabrics for fashion houses, employed 300 people, and had annual revenues in the tens of millions. Edmund Montgomery IV ran First Bank of Millbrook, which had expanded to 6 branches across Connecticut. The bank held mortgages on most properties in town, including, Sarah noted with a chill, the Whitmore Estate itself, or at least it had before she'd purchased it at auction. The Prescott family controlled Prescott Logistics, a shipping and distribution company. The Van Burens had diversified into real estate development and property management. 4 families, all descended from the original compact signatories, still controlling significant portions of Millbrook's economy, still working together, still presumably protecting the secret that had been buried a century ago. Sarah found an article from 5 years ago in the local paper about a labor dispute at Ashford Manufacturing. Workers had tried to form a union, citing low wages and poor conditions. The effort had failed after several organizers had suddenly left town. The article quoted Harrison Ashford III, saying the company had a long tradition of fair treatment of workers and that outside agitators were trying to disrupt Millbrook's harmonious labor relations. The same playbook as 1889, just dressed in modern language. Another article described a controversy when a historian from Yale had tried to research Millbrook's industrial history. He'd been denied access to town archives, and several prominent families had refused interviews. The project had been abandoned. The historian had been quoted saying there was an unusual resistance to examination of the town's past. How many people had tried to uncover this secret over the years? How many had been scared off, paid off, or worse? Sarah's phone buzzed with a response from Professor Whitfield. "Sarah, I just saw your email. This is extraordinary, but you need to be careful. If these families are still powerful, you could be in danger. I'm forwarding everything to a colleague at the AG's office and to a reporter I trust at the Boston Globe. Get somewhere safe. Call me when you can. Do not go back to that property alone." Too late for that, Sarah thought grimly. But at least the evidence was out now, beyond her control. Even if something happened to her, the truth would eventually come out. The diner door opened, and Sarah's heart stopped. Harrison Ashford III walked in, dressed casually in slacks and a sweater, looking like a man out for an early breakfast rather than someone who'd been making threats hours earlier. He spotted Sarah immediately and walked directly to her booth. "Miss Brennan, may I sit?" Sarah's hand moved to her phone, ready to dial 911. "I'd rather you didn't. I'm not here to threaten you." He slid into the seat across from her anyway. "I'm here to explain some things you don't understand, and to offer you a way out of this situation that benefits everyone. The way you offered Catherine Whitmore a way out in 1924. Ashford's expression flickered. Surprise, then something darker. "You found her journal. I wondered if that had survived. Along with the compact, the ledgers, the photographs, and all the evidence of what your families did. And before you threaten me again, you should know I've already sent copies to historians, journalists, and legal experts. Whatever happens to me, the truth is coming out." Ashford was quiet for a long moment, studying her. "You think we're monsters, that we spent a century covering up crimes. You're not entirely wrong, but you don't understand the full context. Then explain it. Explain how wage fixing and union busting and political corruption were justified. Explain what happened to the Whitmore family." The waitress brought Sarah's pancakes and refilled her coffee, seeming oblivious to the tension at the table. Ashford waited until she'd left before speaking again. "Jonathan Whitmore signed the compact in 1889, along with our great-great-grandfathers. He benefited from it for 35 years. His textile business thrived because we eliminated competition. His fortune grew because we controlled wages. He lived in that mansion, hosted those parties, built that life on the same system he later claimed to oppose. So that makes it right. It makes him a hypocrite." In 1924, workers at his factory started making noise about forming a union. Whitmore knew that if they succeeded, and if the union movement spread to our other enterprises, we'd all lose significant profits. But instead of standing with us like he'd agreed to do, he got cold feet, started talking about moral obligations, about the changing times, about how we needed to adapt to new labor laws. Ashford's voice took on an edge. He threatened to expose the compact unless we agreed to dissolve it and allow unionization. He had no right to make that unilateral decision. He'd signed an agreement. He'd sworn to secrecy. He'd built his fortune on the system and then wanted to destroy it to ease his own conscience. So you destroyed him instead. We tried to reason with him, offered him buyout packages, retirement options. He refused everything. Then he went further, started talking about going to state authorities, about revealing our arrangements to newspapers. He'd hidden the original compact document and threatened to release it if we didn't comply with his demands. Sarah leaned forward. "What happened the night of October 24th, 1924? Ashford was silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "My great-grandfather was there. He left a private account of what happened. It's been passed down through the family, along with the understanding that the truth must never become public. Tell me." There was a dinner party, as Whitmore had planned. He'd invited the heads of the other 4 families, thinking he could force a confrontation. He showed them the chamber beneath the ballroom floor, told them the compact document was sealed inside. He demanded we dissolve the arrangement, compensate workers for years of wage fixing, and resign from our businesses. In exchange, he wouldn't release the document. Ashford paused, his face troubled. The other families refused. There was an argument. Whitmore grew increasingly agitated. He had a history of what we'd now call mental health issues, depression, paranoia. That night, under the stress of the confrontation, he broke down, became violent. There was a struggle. What kind of struggle? According to my great-grandfather, Whitmore attacked Edmund Montgomery, Catherine's fiancé, Preston's father. In the chaos, Jonathan pulled a gun. There was a fight to disarm him. Catherine tried to intervene, and Ashford's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The gun went off. Catherine was killed. Her mother Eleanor witnessed it, which destroyed her mentally. Jonathan himself went catatonic with grief and shock. Sarah felt her breath leave her body. Catherine died that night. Yes, not intentionally, not as part of some planned violence, but she died. And it happened in front of her parents and the town's most prominent citizens. The families made a decision that night. If the truth came out, if it became known that the daughter of one of Millbrook's most prominent families had been killed during a confrontation over a document exposing industrial corruption, it would destroy everyone involved. The workers would riot. The town would tear itself apart. The scandal would ruin all our families and probably collapse Millbrook's entire economy. So you covered it up. We did what was necessary to protect the town. Catherine's body was buried quietly, never officially recorded as deceased. Jonathan and Eleanor were placed in private sanitariums, where they spent the rest of their lives. The estate was abandoned, as too painful to return to, too dangerous to sell. The chamber beneath the ballroom was sealed, and everyone agreed to never speak of what happened. Ashford met Sarah's eyes. 4 generations have kept that secret. 4 generations have carried the weight of it. We've tried to do better. We pay fair wages now. We don't interfere with union organizing. We've modernized our business practices, but we can't undo the past. And revealing it now wouldn't bring justice. It would just destroy institutions that employ hundreds of people, damage families who had nothing to do with what happened, and tear apart a town that's finally found stability. Sarah sat back, trying to process what she'd heard. If Ashford was telling the truth, this wasn't a simple story of villains and victims. It was a tragedy born of a corrupt system, ending in violence that no one had intended. But did that justify the cover-up? Did it justify threatening her? What about me? Sarah asked. What happens now that I know? That's what I came to discuss. We're prepared to offer you $2 million for the property and your silence. You'd sign a non-disclosure agreement, leave Millbrook, and never speak of what you found. In exchange, you'd have enough money to start over anywhere you want, pursue any project you choose. No one would bother you again. And if I refuse, Ashford's expression hardened, then we'll fight you with every resource we have. We'll tie you up in lawsuits for years. We'll question your credibility, your mental state. We'll make your life very difficult, Miss Brennan. And in the end, all you'll accomplish is hurting a lot of innocent people who had nothing to do with events from a century ago. Sarah looked down at her untouched pancakes, her mind racing. $2 million, a fresh start, no legal battles, no danger, no consequences, but also no justice, no truth, no acknowledgement of the exploitation and suffering that had built these families' fortunes, no recognition of Catherine Whitmore's death or her parents' destroyed lives. She thought about her ex-husband, how he'd always made the practical choice, the safe choice, how she'd gone along with it for years because it was easier than fighting, how that had worked out for her. I need to think about it, Sarah said finally. Give me 24 hours. Ashford studied her face, then nodded slowly. 24 hours. But Miss Brennan, consider very carefully whether this fight is worth what it will cost you. Some truths don't bring justice. They just bring pain. He stood and walked out of the diner, leaving Sarah alone with her cold coffee and the weight of a century-old secret that had just claimed one more victim to its silence. The sun was rising over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah stared out the window at the picturesque New England town, wondering how many other secrets were buried beneath its charming facade. Her phone buzzed with an email from the Boston Globe reporter. "Received your documents. This is explosive material. I have some questions. When can we talk?" Another email from Professor Whitfield. "The AG's office is interested, but needs verification of authenticity. They want to examine the original documents. Can you provide access?" The evidence was out there now, beyond her control. Even if she took Ashford's money and stayed silent, others would investigate. The secret was already escaping, like air from a punctured balloon. But Sarah had a choice about what role she'd play in what happened next. She could be the person who took the money and walked away, or she could be the person who stood up, who fought, who refused to let the powerful bury the truth one more time. She thought about Catherine Whitmore, young and engaged to be married, trying to intervene in an argument and dying for it. She thought about Jonathan Whitmore, broken by grief and guilt, spending his final days in an institution. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore, witnessing her daughter's death and losing her mind. She thought about the workers whose wages had been fixed, whose unions had been crushed, whose lives had been controlled by families who saw them as resources to be exploited. And she thought about the last 100 years, 4 generations of silence, of covered-up truth, of power protecting power. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing an email to the Boston Globe reporter. "I can provide access to the original documents and show you the hidden chamber where they were found. I'm ready to go on the record with everything I know. When can you get to Millbrook?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself. 24 hours, Ashford had said. By then this story would be national news. Sarah ordered more coffee and settled in to wait for the reporter to arrive. The hardest part was just beginning, but at least she'd made her choice. Some secrets deserved to stay buried. This wasn't one of them. The Boston Globe reporter, Marcus Chen, arrived in Millbrook by noon with a photographer and a legal expert. Sarah met them at the estate, where state investigators were already securing the scene. The hidden chamber, the safe, the documents, everything was being photographed, catalogued and authenticated. Harrison Ashford III appeared at the gates with his lawyers demanding access. The state police turned him away. Over the next 3 days, the story exploded across national media. "Century-old industrial conspiracy exposed," read the headlines. The Millbrook Compact became a case study in corporate corruption, labor exploitation, and the lengths powerful families would go to protect their secrets. The AG's office launched a full investigation. While no criminal charges could be filed for century-old crimes, the publicity alone was devastating for the 4 families. Ashford Manufacturing faced boycotts. First Bank of Millbrook saw massive withdrawals. Local elections turned into referendums on the family's continued influence. But it was the personal stories that resonated most. Descendants of workers who'd been exploited came forward with their own family histories, grandparents who'd died young from unsafe working conditions, great-grandparents who'd lost homes to suspicious foreclosures. The pattern of control and exploitation became undeniable. Sarah gave the full interview, holding nothing back. She described finding Catherine's journal, breaking through the concrete seal, discovering the compact document. She shared Ashford's account of Catherine's death, neither defending nor condemning, simply presenting the truth as she understood it. The families tried to fight back with their own narrative, painting Jonathan Whitmore as an unstable man whose mental breakdown had caused tragedy. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Decades of coordinated exploitation documented in their own handwriting. 6 months later, a settlement was reached. The four families agreed to establish a $50 million fund for descendants of Millbrook workers, create a historical memorial for Catherine Whitmore, and relinquish control of several community institutions. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was acknowledgement. Sarah stood in the renovated ballroom of Whitmore Estate, now officially designated as a historical site. The chamber beneath the floor had been preserved exactly as she'd found it, with a glass floor installed so visitors could see where the compact had been hidden for a century. Professor Whitfield joined her for the official opening. "You did something remarkable, Sarah. You gave voice to people who'd been silenced for 4 generations." Sarah looked down at the chamber where Jonathan Whitmore had tried to force accountability 100 years ago. He tried to do the right thing. It just took a century for someone to finish what he started. The estate would never become the boutique inn Sarah had planned. Instead, it was now the Whitmore Memorial Museum and Labor History Center, documenting both the compact and the broader history of industrial exploitation in New England. Schools brought students, researchers came from universities. The story of what had been buried became a cautionary tale about power, silence, and the cost of keeping secrets. Sarah had used her $2 million offer, not from Ashford, but from the book deal and speaking engagements that followed, to fully restore the estate and establish an endowment for its operation. She lived in the converted carriage house, serving as the museum's director. On the anniversary of the day she'd broken through the concrete seal, Sarah placed flowers in the ballroom, white roses for Catherine Whitmore, who died trying to stop violence and whose story had finally been told. Some secrets deserved to stay buried, but this one, Sarah knew, had needed the light, not for revenge, not even for justice exactly, but for truth, for the recognition that what had happened mattered, that the people who'd suffered mattered, that silence only protects the powerful. As visitors filed through the estate, reading the displays and peering into the hidden chamber, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. She'd come to Millbrook running from a failed marriage, hoping to prove something to herself by restoring a mansion. Instead, she'd restored something far more important: the truth.